world's writers will walk through those gates. And if you hang around, you get a chance to talk to them.
I'm interested in conversations that deal with things that matter, but real, how do we live our lives?
First of all, make climate change personal in your life. The second step is get angry and get active. And the third step, and believe it or not, I think this is the most important. We have to imagine this world that we want to hurry towards.
It's about kindness is looking at people as people and not as I voted this, I do this, whatever it is. There are some people we will never get along with, but most of us are a complex mass of different things.
Hello, I'm Ian Rankin. I've been with the Edinburgh International Book Festival basically since day one. I went as a student, as a reader, as a fan of writing. Later on, I was invited to go as an author, which was a thrill. And it's a spectacular experience. It's a meeting of minds. It's a way to open your mind to new experiences, to new ideas, nuanced debate, entertainment, something for every age group. And that's what keeps me going back year after year after year. Long may it continue.
Hi, welcome to the Edinburgh International Book Festival 2020. My name is Jay G Ying. I'm a writer and critic based in Edinburgh, and I'm really excited today to invite you all into this digital space for a very special event to celebrate the newest book by the brilliant writer Yiyun Li as part of the festival's groundbreaking Voices in Literature series. And I hope many of us are already familiar with Li's remarkable and varied books. Indeed, I think this is actually maybe the second time she is at the festival, having first been here in 2017, when the world was a little less difficult to, was a little less hard to travel across. But we are so happy to have you back here in Edinburgh and to talk about Must I Go? Described by Salman Rushdie as one of the major novelists, Yiyun Li is the author of 3 novels, Where Reasons End, published just last year, The Vagrants, and Kinder Than Solitude, plus 2 short story collections, 1,000 Years of Good Prayers and Gold Boy, Emerald Girl, as well as the profound 2017 memoir, Dear Friend, From My Life I Write to You in Your Life. She has won literary awards, including the Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award and the Guardian First Book Award, and was listed amongst Granta's Best of Young American Novelists in 2017. Her stories have been published in the New Yorker, Paris Review, and elsewhere. She is also a MacArthur Fellow, a recipient of the Wyndham Campbell Prize, and a professor of creative writing at Princeton University. Must I Go is her latest novel, published last week in the UK by Penguin. And the book is very much working in theme with the festival's theme, keeping the conversations going. The novel centers on Lilia, an unforgettable character who is looking back on her long, extraordinary life of 81 years. In a Californian retirement home, she begins to read the posthumously published diaries of her former fleeting lover, Roland. She becomes increasingly fixated by the life of this forgotten man, this intimate history of theirs together. And although she only appears in his diaries a few times, Lilia begins to rewrite the diary with her own incisive commentary, curating into life, I guess, a sort of correspondence to make sense of their past, a past which includes the suicide of Lucy, Roland and Lilia's daughter. So in these two nested stories of Lilia and Roland we find Li's sort of masterful trademark prose, writing that is sort of perceptive and elegant, rich with insight and play, with much to say about grief, resilience, and empathy. One obvious question the novel asks is how to survive the death of one's child, but in other ways, the book is also asking whether one entire life can be ever neatly known on the page in one's personal language. How do we choose to endure, and can the legacy we leave behind ever be given a sense of closure or poetic justice? As Lilia herself asks, can the responsibility to the dead ever be replaced by the responsibility to the living? So, Yiyun, before we move on to our two-way correspondence between ourselves and talk about the book properly, perhaps it would be great if you could read some excerpts from Must I Go?
Yes, okay. Thank you, Jay, for that great introduction. And hello from Princeton, New Jersey. And I'm going to read just a few excerpts from the novel, very short excerpts. As Jay said, part of the novel is Roland's diary, and part is Lilia annotating the diary. So Roland started to keep this diary when he was a teenage boy in Canada. So I'm going to read his first entry of this diary. So at this time he was 19 and living with his relatives. July 1st, 1929. At tea time, Aunt E joked about cousinhood being the only dangerous neighborhood, and I pretended that I did not notice Hetty's twisting fingers. There's plenty of time for her to outgrow her ardor for me. For now, she comes in handy. When she's here for the summer, the role of chaperone falls to Aunt E. To spend time with Hetty means to live near Aunt E than any other time of the year. My cousinly duty to Hetty is a convenient pretext. My love for Aunt E, the context of my existence. Reading Ovid last night, I wondered what plant or beast I deserved to be transformed into if I announced my passion. Will Aunt E remain my sole love? One must be careful not to place one's heart in a cage that can be only unlocked by one key. I desire, however, for Aunt E to acknowledge my love. Accept it even? No matter, my poor dead parents would not have approved, nor would any of my relatives. Yet, is this not the world's due to an orphan who must be granted the rights to the uncommon, even the forbidden? One is not orphaned for nothing. What a scandal we could make. I do believe I shall be able to make a great novel out of this love for Aunt E. So that's starting Roland's nearly 70 years of diary. And I'm going to read 3 annotations Lilia made. So Lilia is at this moment 81, reading the diary and commenting on Roland's life and on her own life. And Lucy is their daughter who committed suicide many years ago. So this episode, she did talk about Lucy. The worst kind of marriage, but just one more thing. This is right after Roland got married in the diary. So she's commenting on marriage. The worst kind of marriage is the one that aims for happiness. Don't tell me that every marriage should have that grand aspiration. A marriage reaching for happiness is like an average Joe wanting to make a cake as tall as Mount Everest and as colorful as a tropical island. And on top of that, to make it edible. I'm not saying it's impossible, but tell me how many people can afford that kind of happiness. We can make do with a sloppy cake as long as it doesn't topple over. Cracked? Fine. A little dense? No problem. Over-sweetened? We can live with that. Underbaked? It won't kill you. Once I watched a movie in which a woman baked a birthday cake for her husband, and then she thought it was not perfect, and she dumped it into the trash can. Oh, I laughed so hard, someone had to shush me in the theater. But people can be stubborn. I shouldn't have laughed at the woman in the movie. Lucy wanted her life to turn out like that perfect cake. It did not, so she dumped it, along with everything else. And this is the next excerpt is actually, Jay talked about closure, and this is Lilia's meditation on closure towards the end of Roland's diary. Closure. I wonder if my great-grandmother Lucille ever thought about that. What's the point of closure when at any moment you could tumble off your mule into the valley and never see another day again? Or your best pal could hack you to death at night so he could run away with your $200 worth of gold. Rattlesnakes and grizzly bears and floods and snowstorms, would they be so kind to wait until you find closure? And the man whom great-grandmother Lucille took care of, both his legs amputated, just lying there waiting for death, what use would he have had for that comforting word? There was this young Miwok mother, 14, really still a girl, when her white husband was crushed by a fallen tree and her tribe refused to take her and her baby back. Great-grandmother Lucille made a place for them in her household. When the baby died, the young mother returned to her tribe. Did she think about closure then? Did great-grandmother Lucille, who was said to have treated the girl as her own daughter, the baby, her grandchild? Gilbert was right. I am as hard as the hardest life. My love is as hard as I am. I came from a settler's family. Like a settler, I have lived through the bumps and wounds and amputations and death. I don't mope. Gave me an axe and a hoe, and I'll start a garden. Gave me a good man, and I'll build a family with him. Anything I can do, I do it with all my might. But I don't fight storms and floods and earthquakes. I don't deceive myself into thinking I can be who I am not. But I was born 100 years too late. We were settled people when I was born. Everyone is settled now and will be settled forever. I'm going to stop here, Jay. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Yiyun. That was beautiful to hear, and especially great to hear aloud, because so much of the book is in this close first person, and through this mode of the diary, which of course is a very personal object, and diary writing is a very sort of personal act. So I'm curious, I want to sort of begin, I guess, by asking you, going back to the book as a whole, its structure, why did you choose this diary form that your characters are so invested in?
Yes. So I am, for myself, for my reading, I like to read people's diaries and letters. And partly I think these things are written in vivo, which means, we're not coming back to rewrite history in retrospect. So diaries are often, I am obsessed with people's diaries. But I also realize, after you read a lot of diaries, you can get a sense that people are not that honest in their diaries. People are still, first of all, they make up an audience, even though it's only written for themselves. And then they make up themselves in the way they want to be remembered. And that dichotomy between truth and untruth in a diary always fascinates me. Of course, Roland is this, as a character, he's this obsessive diarist, because he is thinking about keeping a record for his posterity, for people to get to know him. And that, to me, offers quite a good way to enter Roland as a character. And Lilia is the opposite. Lilia does not want to be known. Lilia does not want to be remembered. And yet, I think Roland's diary provides the structure for Lilia to talk about things that she evades all these years. So I think, in a way, I think Roland's diary is it's the scaffold of this novel. And on top of that scaffold, of course, Lilia is writing not only to Roland, but to her dead daughter, Lucy. So almost as though Lilia is writing letters to people who will never receive these letters. So I think that is the format of the novel reflects maybe just my interest in reading people's diaries and letters.
Yeah, and I definitely think, when you look at Roland's diary, I think he does himself admit in the book that he often lies or exaggerates. And Lilia, I think, is very conscious of the fact that there is this unreliability in the memory, in the memories which Roland has selected, which can be flawed, which can be sort of self-edited or self-censored. There's a sort of artifice in the book, which I think is makes it so fun to read, because actually, as a fellow writer as well, you populate the book with writers and books and readers with this act of writing. Roland fancies himself to be a big writer. He wants to write himself into history. Lilia is sort of forced to take this memoir writing class in her retirement home. But there are also other writers, other storytellers as well. And I guess I was curious as to what you think the book is saying about writing as a sort of maybe medium for, as you sort of said, uncovering these sort of truths, these sort of from the past.
Yeah, I think Roland, of course, is a selective truth teller, or he admits he has some of the events in his life he has exaggerated, and he wants to be a novelist. He is fictionizing his life. He's optimizing his life as fiction, which, as writers, as novelists, I think we all feel that urge, to get the best out of something. That's what Roland's, I think that's Roland's sort of intuition. But Lilia, I like Lilia. She's unwilling memoirist. When she is in the home, when she's in the retired home, all the women wanted her to join the memoir writing class, and she refused. She said something about her peers, going to the writing class. They were like, plum turkeys being baked with apples and all these things in their tummies. They look very golden and edible. And she said, no, thank you. No, I want to be that wild turkey trotting down the memory lane by myself. So Lilia is outspoken. Lilia talks, but he doesn't actually like to talk about herself. And again, I think not speaking. So it's interesting as Roland speaks a lot about himself, yet he is choosing details and he's selecting details. He is not telling the whole truth. And Lilia, to me, Lilia is not telling by withholding this information. She's also choosing not to tell the truth. Also like in the mirror image way of Roland's diary keeping. So I think, that's something that we always think about when we write as writers. How much do we put in? How much remains unsaid? The unspoken probably sometimes is the most important thing in a book or in a story. So yes, I think I'm glad you had fun. I had fun writing these two strange writers.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point you make that maybe you don't see Lilia as a writer or perhaps a reluctant writer, because when I was reading through, I was very struck by seeing Lilia as almost a sort of excavator, an archaeologist. She's doing this historical, personal archaeology of her past and Roland's past, and she's rewriting, yes, but she's also almost providing a sort of errata to his story, his narrative. And I'm so thinking of this line where you say, all women must have spoken to themselves words unheard by their husbands, which I think really sort of shows this idea of Roland, who is very masculine and writing and saying all these things, and actually it's the women in the stories who have these secret lives, which have yet to be uncovered. Yeah, and if we want to talk a bit about Lilia, I think she's a compulsive character. She is so memorable. She's spiky. She's proud, strong, acerbic. She sees through the cliche, the metaphor, in order to perceive things as they really are. Yet, in her almost impossibly long life, the reader begins to learn that it is filled with vulnerability, regret, and shame. But at times, often she's sort of wrestling with the reader, with maybe even the author. She wants to jump out of the page. Was she difficult for you to write?
She is difficult and she's fun. And I must say, I find her a challenging character because, as you said, she has this resistance. Some of the characters come, like Roland, is quite cooperative. Roland just tells his story, even though I don't trust him. I like him just writing his diary. Lilia is not cooperative. Lilia is actually resisting with the. I think I always think of writing novels as a way to establish a relationship with the character, and my relationship with Lilia was fraught throughout writing her, because she says things that I don't trust. For instance, as you said, she has all these vulnerable moments in her life. She had all these painful memories, but she never dwell upon them. And if she has a moment of opening up, say, there's one moment she said, really, Lucy, her daughter, really broke my heart. And right after she said that, she started to make jokes about heart. How can heart be broken? Where are the pieces? My heart is pretty well at this moment. My heart is jumping really good. So I think she has that tendency of just telling you one glimpse of truth and then withdrawing, retreating to her sort of well-masked narrative. So I think my relationship with Lilia, my writing her, it's really a battle. She's a willful woman. As a character, she's a willful character. And she's a willful woman in life. And I feel like I don't have many good things that I can boast of, but I am a willful person. So I feel that writing Lilia is really just a wrestling between her willfulness and my willfulness. And even then, I think after the first draft, my editor said, well, don't you think, Lilia is really so well hidden behind the mask? Where is the weakest link? So I think it's a constant battle with Lilia in writing that novel.
Yeah, and I think I totally agree. I think Lilia, she wants to get the final word into the story. And I'm interested, I guess, going back to the writing of this book, how tempted or how resistant were you to let her get the final word in? As in, I think with a book like this, which deals with such sort of important themes, there's a sort of almost expectation of how this book might end. And I was wondering, as a writer, whether you resisted that sort of sense of closure, or whether you felt that you wanted to go beyond sort of providing something which readers might have expected, or you yourself might have expected from the novel.
Right. Yeah, I think writing, Lilia really truly wants the last word on everything. And as you're right, I think the impulse control, I mean, I call it impulse control. I almost have to put just a little pressure on her. And on Roland too. Roland also just speaks on and on about himself. And sometimes you just want to say to them, shut up, you know, I want to hear the real things. But with Lilia, I think, well, my tendency is to let her talk. And I realized the more you want her to talk about the truth, she says the false things. And I talk about Lilia as though she's a real person. She's made up here, but she is real in the way that she doesn't follow my order or follow my creativity or creative process. So I think my solution is actually I wrote much like a draft in the draft stage. It was a much longer novel. So I had Lilia speak all these things, all the final words, you know, all the things she wanted to say. And sooner or later, you know, a character can speak all the untruths, but sooner or later, this is like real life. People crack and characters crack. And I think after having spoken 400 pages of not so true, you know, statements about herself, she finally cracked a little. And those are the moments I think I preserved in the final draft more than anything.
Yeah, I think, and you know, you do mention in the book that Lilia finds language sort of mistrustful. She sort of talks about all these useless words which sort of accumulate, and if only she could sort of tear them down like weeds and sort of pare things back to the bone. And I'm curious, sticking with Lilia for a little bit more, I'm curious as to her relationship with the other characters in the book, the other female characters especially, that we get a glimpse of via Roland's diary. Roland's encounter with Sidel, for example. Sidel and Lilia are both similar in some ways. They've both lost a child. And when we meet them in the book, they are sort of speaking from an elderly age, looking back. But they are also quite different in other ways. And I'm interested in why Lilia finds this figure of Sidel, this high aristocratic, this high society woman, so fascinating.
Yes. Yes, you know, for one reason, of course, Roland has been obsessed with Sidel all his life. You know, Roland had this tendency of falling in love with older women, but his relationship with Sidel, he thought was his lifelong love story, was with this, you know, as you said, high society woman who used to be a poet and who used to be a painter. But I think Lilia's obsession when she was younger, she first encountered Sidel's name was when she was having her short affair with Roland, and she heard about this woman, and she was full of resentment and she was full of jealousy because she could not be Sidel. But I think after she started to read Roland's diaries, she realized there's more to that woman than just being, you know, an obsession for Roland. So, as you said, you know, Sidel lost one child, two husbands, and Lilia said, "I lost one child, I lost three husbands, but mathematics don't count in these, you know, situations. You lose someone, you lose someone." So I think her obsession with Sidel is, I think, it probably reflects my thinking about fiction often is about alternative. So I think all characters have alternatives. And and we in life also start with a lot of alternatives. But as we live on, as a novel goes on, we sort of, our alternatives, we started to lose our alternatives, and our life narrows down a little. It becomes one path, because we can never take another path once we pass that point. So Lilia's obsession with Sidel, I think, is, Lilia has a mind. She was born in California. She grew up on a ranch. She wasn't educated, but she thought about her other alternative. And she realized in the end, when she commented on the journal, on Roland's diary, when she was an older woman, she realized all these lives she wanted to be Sidel, but it didn't matter. She said something I really like. She said, it doesn't matter, Sidel is not Lilia, and Lilia is not Sidel. We're really the same kind of women, and then she went on to talk about how women deal with living and losing things. And so I think her relationship with Sidel is really her relationship with all sorts of women in the world. And at one point she quoted one of her ancestors from the gold rush. She said, "Pioneer is a man's job. Pioneers are men, but pioneering is a woman's job." And that's how she looked at living too, I think.
Yeah, I think that was when I read that line, I was very struck by it, because I think it's a sort of very interesting twist on the sort of traditional American sort of dream narrative. And that brings me nicely onto a question I wanted to ask about your decision to set or to have influenced the book, these themes of pioneering, settling, and settlers in the backdrop of the sort of American West, the Californian gold rush. What drew you to that time and sort of place?
Yeah, so there's several reasons. One is, I usually have a delayed reaction to places. So when I first moved away from China, when I first started writing, I started to write about China because China was the past. And I lived in the Midwest of America for years, and only after I moved away from Midwest, I started to write about, central part of America. And when I started Must I Go, I had lived in California for nearly a decade, and California started to accumulate for me as a place to set my characters' lives. And the other thing is, you're right, this settlers' history. I mean, I think we hear about immigrant stories, which is, if you look at literature, I myself, I'm an immigrant writer, but I think simply calling something like an immigrant literature doesn't feel enough for me. I think, beyond immigrant, it is our settlers' spirit, right? So like when I first came to America, I only had 2 suitcases. Everything I needed in life was in those 2 suitcases. That's the same as all these settlers coming from, especially Gold Rush. If you read documentary from the time, letters and diaries, people from all over the world, Europe, Asia, South America, Mexico, they all had this dream. And I feel that is, to me, it's one essence of America, and it's also an essence of California. Mm-hmm. So that's one reason and the other reason is 1945. So Roland and Lilia met the first time in 1945, UN Peace Conference in San Francisco. I was also fascinated by that conference because that was right before World War ended. Mm-hmm. And if you read the newspapers from the time, or documentary from the time, people were so hopeful. People were talking about the golden future of humankind. They thought, there are 2 world wars. We're going to end all the miseries. We're going to love each other. And the newspaper said back then, 80% of population on Earth represented in San Francisco. And this is for like a loving human future. And that kind of hope, of course, if you look at the past 60 years of history, well, there's no golden future or there's no golden anything we have seen but misery or war and famine and all these terrible things. So So I do think, that 1945 is a moment of Californian history when it represented so much. But I wanted to go from there to look at, American history in the past 60 years as Lilia would look at it.
And it's history which is perhaps not so obviously in the foreground, but it's rumbling away in the background of Lilia's life. Importantly, there's a sort of panoramic, seismic events which are happening. And you mentioned the sort of San Francisco Peace Conference, and that's also where we first meet Gilbert, who is Lilia's, one of Lilia's husbands, and it's the husband that we get the most sort of insight into. And Gilbert, we meet him when he's young. He's a sort of young dreamer, I guess. He's a sort of meek sort of personality. And he, as you said, is very bowled over by this potential for this world to be united, this utopian ideal. And I think maybe you could speak a little bit to contrast him to Roland, who during the war, Roland becomes a propagandist almost.
Yeah.
He writes political slogans. Maybe you could speak a bit more about those two, the relationship between those two characters.
Yes, it's such a great contrast, right? So the two extremes in Lilia's life, these two men probably are the most important men in her life. And Gilbert, I think, has that sense of, American idealism. He wanted to love, he wanted to give, he wanted to make the world a better place for his children and grandchildren. And all these things are just wonderful if you see that in a man, yes? And what's interesting to me is, there are people who live through many different historical events, but there would be one historical event in their lives that would be the event and the thing that mattered. And for Gilbert, there was, Vietnam War coming up, his child had to run to Canada to evade the war. But for him, that moment in 1945 determined his life. And so he aligned his entire life's dream to that kind of, it's propaganda too when you call, united, world population in loving each other. So Roland, of course, has much more cynical view of history, and coming from, an orphan's background, I think, sometimes we forget he started as an orphan. He did not have parents. He did not have a history known to him. He only had spots of what happened to his parents, fragments of memories, but he did not have anything. So he represents the other kind of, I think, human nature is they isolate themselves, or Roland isolated himself from history. And he wanted to be bigger than history. No matter what history is, he wants to be remembered. He wants to live in history. He wants, as you said, he wants to write his name into history. But he doesn't really care what history is. And he just wants to be part of it. So I think he and Gilbert, of course, are I think they're great characters for me to look at history and how we read history and how we live in history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, definitely. They are really memorable, and it's hard to sort of say who the reader is rooting for, actually, because they're both so complex and fleshed out really well. I wanted to sort of maybe pivot back to writing in general. I think there are some sort of thematic similarities between your memoir, Dear Friend, Where Reasons End, which some people have called a semi-autobiographical novel, which you may or may not disagree with, and Must I Go? So I'm curious as to what you found the challenges were moving into when you were writing Must I Go, away from those other two books.
Yeah, I want to, as you said, Where Reasons End certainly was largely based in my life story. And the writing of Must I Go was a strange experience for me. In fact, I started Must I Go before I wrote Where Reasons End. So I was halfway through the novel. Lucy already committed suicide, and Lucy was 27. Lilia was 44 when Lucy died. And Well, I was working on this novel, of course, as shown or as known from Where Reasons End, my son committed suicide. And I was 44 when that happened. And that coincidence was quite striking for me at that time. And I thought there was no way I could finish writing that novel, because it's as though I knew something was coming and I could finish a novel. But I think Lilia was, I like when you said you cannot forget her. Lilia was quite also a gripping character. She's so different from me. And my decision of not finishing a novel didn't quite sit well with her. And I think she just kept coming back to, she just kept coming back to me. And eventually I thought that the only reason to do it is just to write it. And so, of course, I came back to the novel after finishing Where Reasons End. I was so hesitant only because I think there was this overlapping of biographical detail between Lilia and me. But I think that also happened just, to me, it's by accident, right? It happened by chance that she just happened to be in the same category, or she happened to experience the same thing as I did. So I think after that, writing about Lilia is really just to find a way to say, yes, here's another mother who lost a child. Let me just look into her life. And that's the most important task I have. So that's how I think writing that novel, coming after Where Reasons End, it went to a different place. I think it went to a messier. It's a messier novel. It's a bigger, messier novel. But I was glad I did it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think when I first read about this coincidence, as you say, it's almost sort of difficult to believe the sort of similarities of sort of life compared to fiction. And then I guess when you were coming back to Must I Go, did you feel any sort of pressure to write a narrative about sort of grief and sort of suicide in a sort of particular way, or did you feel that you could sort of have a sort of, I guess, more freer way of writing those topics?
Yeah. See, yeah, I people would call, say, Lilia a grieving mother, right? So I myself resist that word, grieve or grieving, for many reasons. But I think what happened was Lilia really defined herself through many things, and Lucy was one of the happenings in her life. I don't think she, just defined herself by saying she was a mother who lost a child. That's not the only narrative in her life. And that's a little freedom for me to say, yes, tragedy happens. The unspoken pain is there, but yet there are other things to look at. She has that settler's spirit. And she said, I'm going to make a garden. No matter what, I'm going to make a garden for my children, for my grandchildren. That's, I would hesitate to call it hopeful, but I would say willful, willfulness on her part is she's going to live every day despite all these things that happen to her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess when you sort of say that you don't like the word grief, it sort of echoes what sort of Lilia is herself speaking about in the novel, about her distrust of this language of grief, of metaphor, and I guess coming from, thinking about your other books as well, Dear Friend, I think it's really interesting, your perspectives on language, on sort of metaphor. Do you feel like in Must I Go, it sort of gave you room to explore in greater detail your sort of ideas about language?
Yes, I think you're right. I'm one of the, of course, one thing I feel important is the precision of language. And metaphor can be a slippery slope, right? And cliches, I'm very sensitive to cliches. I have this allergic reaction to cliches or anything words that people use without thinking. So I think in my previous two books, in my memoir and Where Reasons End, the the center, part of those two books is centering around the precision of language and what language can do and what language cannot do, where words fall short. And I think Must I Go is a little easier in that way because Lilia and Roland, Lilia questions all cliches, but Roland uses cliches all the time, and he doesn't have an imaginative or creative mind. So I think I would say it's a little bit less pressure to explore that same fascination that I have. I mean, of course, I would say Lilia has moments of questionings. People say water under the bridge. And she started to say, who invented this saying? Which bridge is that for that man? And then she went on to talk about how people use words without thinking. So I think in that way, I think she and I have something in common.
Great, thank you. Our time is sadly nearly up. I think in lieu of a sort of normal audience Q&A, I thought it might be a sort of fun substitution to ask you, Yiyun, what question do you wish audiences would ask of you at literary readings, but never do, and how would you answer it?
Yeah, there's one time I went to give a reading and someone said in the audience said, well, nobody has ever told me you're funny. I wish they told me. I would have read your books, probably a long time ago. Well, one thing that I don't think people ask me is about humor. I do think, for instance, writing about Lilia, she's hilarious. Sometimes she says things that while I was writing, she made me laugh. And I know people tend to ask questions about the sort of the heaviness of my work. And I agree, I think there's a lot of heaviness, but there's also the opposite is the lightness. And I wish readers would ask at readings, but really people never ask.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I would agree. I think Must I Go is a very funny book. There were many laugh out loud moments, Lilia especially. I remember one point when she says in her annotation, don't skip this part, which I think was a sort of quite clever sort of meta way of playing about it. Thank you. To end, I just want to say that Must I Go can be bought at the festival's independent online bookshop, shop.edbookfest.co.uk. You must go buy it. This year's festival program is free of charge for everyone and has been made possible by the generosity of supporters and donors. If you've enjoyed this event, we'd love for you to consider making a donation to the Edinburgh International Book Festival so they can continue putting on work for people. Thank you for everyone who has made this event safe and possible. The festival team, Poppy from Penguin, the future audience watching this pre-recorded event, thank you as well for listening. And of course, most of all, thank you to Yiyun Li for the generosity in sharing your words and giving us your time today. It's been an amazing event, and I hope you've enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, Jay, for sharing this. I enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.